They have taken over control. They are now looking at other locations to take over. We've worked too hard to ensure equal and fair access to the ballot to turn back now. I'll be happy to answer your questions and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Voting is sacred to me. I see the voting process as one that should be as easy as possible for all eligible voters. And I feel like voting rules should be everything but in no way to restrict people's freedom to vote. This past year, I had to go to extraordinary lengths to accomplish the simple but consequential task of casting my ballot. I, along with thousands of Georgians, had to wait for hours in order to cast my vote. In fact, I had to go to the polls twice in order to vote. The first time, I went to the closest polling place opened the first day of early voting. That was Perry Courthouse in Perry, Georgia. I went with an elderly couple in the 70s. We arrived at 7:15 in the morning, Tuesday, October 13, knowing that the voting polls will open at 8 a.m. We thought that we arrived with plenty of time to vote quickly and be in our way. To our surprise, there was already a line around the courthouse, snaking all the way around the block. One of my elderly friends is a knee replacement candidate and is a diabetic, and his wife, a retired teacher from the state of Georgia, has an acute arthritis condition and uses a walker. I was worried about them standing in line and going up the stairs, as there was no separate line for people with disabilities. We knew that they could not sustain waiting in that line, so we left without voting. They ended up voting by mail. A week later, on October 27, 2020, a Tuesday, my wife and I went back to early vote. This time, we went to the Middle Georgia Technical College in Warner Robins, which was open only for the last 2 weeks of early voting. We arrived around 3 p.m. My wife had a co-worker who recently moved from Puerto Rico and was new to Georgia. She registered to vote, but had no previous experience voting in Georgia and was confused about the process. We arranged to meet her at the time we arrived at the line at the polling place. Once again, the line outside around the building in the open with no protection from the elements. After an hour and a half standing outside, we made it inside the building, finally, just to find out that the line inside the building was just as long as the line outside the building. My wife's co-worker became concerned that she would not be in time to pick up her baby at the child care center, which closed at 6 p.m. We ended up casting our ballots around 6 p.m., 3 hours after we arrived. We learned later that her husband had to take time off from work and was able to pick up the baby. We were able to handle those 3 hours standing in line, but we know that not everybody can. Election observers reported that several people fainted while in line in Savannah and in Atlanta. I have also learned that between 2012 and 2018, 214 polling locations were closed in the state of Georgia, mostly affecting minority voters, making this issue even worse. Senators, this is wrong. It should not take so long to vote. According to the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, no citizen should have to wait more than 30 minutes to vote. I had to wait 6 times that measure, and other citizens of this state had to wait even more. It is unacceptable that in Houston, Cobb, and Chatham counties, a person will have to wait half a day or miss a full day of work, or maybe 2, just to exercise their constitutional right. Our government needs to ensure that we have adequate systems and processes in place to allow every eligible voter to cast their ballot without such undue burdens. We need to have adequate number of polling places, properly resourced, and open for as expansive period of time as possible, especially after regular duty hours. Voters should have the opportunity to vote on Saturdays or Sundays. After all, if malls are open on Sundays, why not voting places? Lots of people work on Saturdays, so Sundays need to be an option as well. It would also make it much easier if some people to vote for some people to vote if election day were to be a holiday. In conclusion, I serve my country as a member of the armed forces and continue to serve by encouraging voting in my community. I am here to respectfully ask for your help, senators, in protecting the freedom of all voters to vote, regardless of their political affiliation, by passing legislation that will address the unacceptably long waiting in lines and ensure that every eligible voter has the opportunity to participate, not just those of us who can take 3 hours off from work and stand in line, and so that nobody has to choose between a paycheck and exercising a much sacred constitutional right. Thank you, and I'll be.
Thank you very much, Mr. Segar. Thanks to all our witnesses. I do want to make clear that we, of course, gave the opportunity for our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to provide witnesses to defend the law, but they chose not to have anyone here or had trouble finding anyone here to defend this law. With that, I would like to ask you, Mr. Segarra, as someone who has served our country, shared your story about what happened in Houston County in South Central Georgia. When you signed up to serve our country, to join the Air Force, you didn't have to wait in line. Is that correct?
That is correct, Madam.
Uh-huh. And most people you know who served, they were probably welcome to serve and to put their life on the front line, and they didn't have to stand in a waiting line.
That is correct.
Do you agree that voters shouldn't have to wait in line to participate in our democracy?
Most definitely.
Okay. And how does that make you feel when you have to go to those lengths, not only for yourself and your family, but your neighbors and friends and seniors to help them when, in fact, you have served our country on the front line? Tell me a little bit about that, your decision to serve our country and then your devotion to our democracy.
I was born and raised in Puerto Rico in a family with military background. My grandfather served in the front line in Europe during World War II, in the front line in Korea, and also in Vietnam. He was my inspiration to join the military, and I took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. As citizens of this nation, we have the moral right to and sacred duty to vote. I felt awful that I was standing in line, got there, and was not able to cast my vote. nor the people that I brought with me. I saw people in the line waiting, saw people in that line coming into the parking lot and seeing the size of the line and leaving. That's not acceptable. So much blood was shed in those battles. And the minimum we can do as citizens is to be allowed to exercise freely our right to vote.
Thank you. And yesterday I was in Cobb County with Stacey Abrams, and we heard very similar stories from across Georgia with the lines and people getting so hot in the sun, and the fact that this bill would now deny the right of nonpartisan volunteers to provide water would make things, I would say, even worse. Let me go to you, Ms. Butler. You saw many voters cast ballots last year as a former election official in rural Morgan County. Do you agree that the new Georgia law will result in fewer voters casting a ballot in future elections? And how do you think it's going to impact the citizens in your county?
It definitely will make it more difficult, barriers, hurdles that they will have to get across to even exercise their right to vote. For instance, in rural Georgia, you don't have broadband. Now you have photo ID. You have to make copies of those. You can't upload them on a portal for the absentee ballot portal that they're supposed to put in place. There isn't broadband that people have in those rural areas that will be able to do that. To even make copies for each and every election, you have to make a copy of that ID in order to be able to use the process of absentee voting. And in COVID, as it is still flaring up again, we know that it may still be in place for this next election cycle that's coming up. But it makes it more difficult for people to really exercise their right. And for me, being on the board, having people that are able to look at the process and say, this is how we should do it, is not going to be available as well, because you'll have these partisan boards that will be instituted by a one-sided party. For my county, exactly. So it will take away the ability of people to have more polling locations, drop boxes inside, the hours that they'll be able to vote.
Limiting the hours.
The farmers, you have people that do farming. They work late hours. They won't be able to get there by 5 o'clock. If they do, they lose revenue. So those are the kinds of things that will happen as a result of these barriers that are put in place. They may be able to get over the hurdles, but my God, what kind of barriers will they have to do to get there to that? Paying somebody to take you to that polling location for those hours. You can only use a drop box in early voting
locations and following those hours. So if you had
Correct.
the farmer that wanted to go there afterwards, those drop boxes won't even be allowed to receive votes, which is the whole
Correct.
idea of a drop box.
Correct.
In addition to less drop boxes.
Exactly. And if you miss the early voting period, you won't be able to use the drop box process at all. So that is a problem with this bill.
Okay. Thank you very much. Senator Harrell, another strange thing in this bill, I guess not strange, but intentional, is that they brought back the idea that you have to put your birth date on an envelope. Is that correct? The inner envelope.
That's right. There are several things that you have to write on the envelope, and then the flap covers that information. But one of the reasons that the birth date was removed is because people got confused, and instead of putting their birth date, they put the date that they filled out the application.
I would think they would think that date was more relevant at that moment. Yes.
Right, exactly. So that led to confusion. So they've again legislated situations that are going to increase the confusion on the part of the voters and give the election officials, which are going to be more partisan, more reason to reject those ballots.
And I hope people watching today see this pattern here, because a lot of focus has been on the water, and we are grateful to Senator Ossoff for the bill to address that. but we know there's even more. And a lot of this is about confusion. The different rules that were set that you can't vote on Saturday and Sundays in the runoff, but you can in the general election. You can imagine someone might have voted that way, they think they can, and then they show up and they find out they can't. The date going back on the envelope, this changing hours and polling locations that are open for one election and not the other. Could you briefly talk about, Senator Harrell, how that just leads to people just turning away from voting?
Sure. So in general, this bill is just making it harder to vote. In 2020, 26% of our voters voted by mail, and that was due to the pandemic. I assume that that will probably go back down, but many of the people who voted by mail did so because they knew the process was confusing, but they knew how to do it. And it would mean that if they voted by mail, they didn't have to show up in person to vote, which would keep the lines shorter. So the more you confuse the vote by mail process, the more people are going to be in line on to vote in person. And when they can't file those absentee ballots the weekend before the election, those ballots have to be canceled in person, which gums up the lines more.
So let me just ask you one last question. Some people claim that ID requirements were needed to prevent fraud, but we know that election fraud is exceedingly rare. In fact, as the New York Times editorial board noted, Oregon, home of my good friend Senator Merkley, has sent out more than 100 million mail-in ballots since 2000 and has documented only about a dozen cases of proven fraud. Rounded to the 7th decimal point, that's 0.000001 of all votes cast. Do you think, just based on what you know of the legislative discussion in Georgia, do you think that the new identification requirements in SB 202 in Georgia were really intended to prevent fraud?
No, I actually don't. And we had a number of Republicans who stated that, in fact.
Really? It said that they weren't intended to, because I thought they were saying they were for.
No, in fact, one of my colleagues in the House, Representative Alan Powell, actually in a committee meeting said to somebody who was testifying, "You're correct. It wasn't found," meaning fraud. It's just in a lot of people's minds that there was. He actually said that in a committee meeting. It's really not there. It's just in a lot of people's minds that there was. So this legislation is based on things of the imagination in people's minds.
Well, and much worse stuff than that. So I would call that, as a former prosecutor, a smoking gun piece of evidence where you have someone admitting that there really isn't fraud, but they're going ahead anyway. So thank you. Senator Merkley.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for your testimony. Mr. Segarra, you mentioned that a lot of voting locations were eliminated. I think you said hundreds of voting locations that had a bigger effect, if I understood you correctly, on communities of color. Did I understand that correctly?
That is correct.
So we have a bill, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which says that denial of the ability to vote or the abridgment to vote is unlawful when it is targeted at communities of color. It sounds like certainly, at least in spirit and perhaps in law, a violation of the Voting Rights Act.
That is correct.
And so I'm very struck that there was a significant factor of using long lines and fewer voting locations targeted at communities of color. And it's just wrong on every moral, ethical, and perhaps legal level. So that's an issue that should be fixed. So I wanted to ask State Senator Harrell, in those 80 pages of Senate Bill 202, 202? Do I have the number right? Yes.
Yes.
Did they address having a fair number of precincts and a solution so that people would not have to wait in line so that everyone would have a fair and free equal chance to vote?
There actually is a piece of a section in the bill that says that if it's documented that people have to wait for a certain amount of time, that during the next election, that precinct would be split. But that's a bit of a smoking gun as well, because another tactic that's been used in the past for voter suppression is the changing of precinct locations. Okay, voters are creatures. People are creatures of habit. They tend to, if they did something one way once, they think that that is supposed to happen the same way the next time, and that's logical. So the voting location changes, or voting location, the precinct gets split. They go to where they used to vote and wait in line, and their name's not on the roll. So then they have to go someplace else, or they go someplace and it's closed and they don't know where to go.
Right, and so promising to do it in a future election is pretty irrelevant because they could change the precinct locations any way in all sorts of other fashions. One of the points of confusion I also heard was that the early voting locations were not necessarily the same as election day locations, and that created confusion. Does the bill that was written address that real problem?
No, it does not. And that is a huge issue for voters showing up where they voted early and finding out that they can't vote there, like the gentleman that I described.
In fact, they made it worse because they said if you vote out a precinct on election day, too bad, your vote is burned up, wasted,
Unless it's after
tossed
5
aside,
o'clock.
shredded. That is really completely outrageous. As the chairwoman pointed out, in Oregon, we've had vote by mail. It was initiated by Republicans in our state who wanted to increase turnout in the Republican Party. We have vote by mail in Utah, a very red state. So this has not been a partisan issue at all, in that it serves all citizens well. And it's an antidote to the antics on election day. Because what we see across the nation is it's so easy to discourage or obstruct voting on election day. You move the location. You put the location where there's not enough parking. You understaff it so people are in long lines. We heard yesterday about folks who had waited, one man 6.5 hours, one woman 7 hours to vote. People have children to pick up at daycare. They have jobs they can't be apart from. They have health conditions. So aren't these election day tactics really basically another new form of Jim Crow antics to try to prevent Black Georgians from voting? Mrs. Butler?
I
Ms.
would
Butler?
say yes, it is. It's for people of color. It was put in place just for that purpose. Long lines and making it more difficult is just a barrier.
Well, I was struck by the testimony that the no excuse vote by mail was implemented while the state, as I understand it, was a majority Republican in the legislature, in the House and the Senate, and I believe the governorship as well in 2005. So what magically happened? Were there, as pointed out in Oregon, we have found fraud is infinitesimally rare. And when it happens, that fraud is normally somebody who moved into Oregon from another state. So they voted in an earlier primary, then they vote in a later primary, which they're not supposed to do, or something of that nature. In other words, we're talking, even though a small number of cases, at to the 7th decimal point rare. But was something dramatically different in Georgia that suddenly vote by mail became a documented source of corruption or illegality?
Well, it was primarily used beforehand by non-people of color. This time, because of the pandemic, a lot of people of color decided that they weren't going to get exposed to COVID, so they used the vote by mail process. We were pushing vote by mail. We wanted people to be safe. We wanted our election workers to be safe. So therefore, we all did vote by mail. We have been pushing for decades now, souls to the polls, our vote from the comfort of your pew. I did a program with faith-based organizations where we would teach them how to use the absentee voting process and do it as a Sunday activity where they all fill out their ballots at home, bring it, put it in the mail bin, the mailman picks it up, and they will have voted from the comfort of the pew with their pastors. That's a process we were teaching them to do.
So when this tool was primarily utilized by white voters, it was promoted and celebrated. But when Black Georgians said, we too will use this tool, suddenly it came under attack by the legislature.
Yes.
I'm just extraordinarily appalled by this. Because we were the first vote by mail state, we in Oregon pay a lot of attention to this. And there are multiple provisions, which I will not go through because you're all familiar with them, attack to making it harder to do vote by mail, from drop boxes to ID requirements, so on and so forth. But this is of extraordinary concern that here we are in the year 2021, 56 years after the Voting Rights Act was passed, when we thought we had finally come to the point of a full understanding in America that we are all about fair and free elections for every American to participate in, new forms of obstruction. They're more subtle, right? I think Georgia was the first state in the union to produce a poll tax to try to prevent poor individuals from voting and communities of color from voting. Well, here we are with a modern version of that, and it is deeply disturbing, and I thank you all for your testimony.
Good. Thank you, Senator Merkley. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to pick up on an issue that Senator Merkley raised about the partisanship versus bipartisanship nature of this whole conversation. When we're in Washington, in the Capitol, many of our Republican colleagues talk about the need for bipartisanship if we're going to be amending or changing voting rights laws or election laws, and how Democrats should not pass voting rights protections on a party line basis. That's what they tell us. Now, look, I agree. We shouldn't have to. Defending our fundamental right to vote should not be a partisan issue. It should be a non-partisan issue. And just last week, in a Judiciary Committee hearing, reminded our colleagues, both sides of the aisle, of this radical concept I think we all were taught in high school government class, that our democracy works best when as many eligible people participate. We actually went around the table with the witnesses, both Democratic witnesses and Republican witnesses, and asked the question if they agreed or if they disagreed. Of course, they all agreed. Our democracy is stronger when more eligible people participate, not less. But unfortunately, our Republican colleagues' deeds don't match their words. They'll say publicly that they support voting rights, but their actions show something different. Now, indeed, when a lot of our Republican colleagues in the Senate minority held up democracy expanding legislation like the For the People Act in Washington, they stay silent when their Republican colleagues in state house after state house after state house across the country are ramming through voter suppression laws without input from Democratic colleagues in those very same state houses. Now, in the news these days is dozens of legislators from Texas that have left the state to break quorum in an effort to block these voter suppression laws. They're in Washington, bring their advocacy there. Texas is the most recent example, but clearly in calendar year 2021, Georgia was the first. I have a question for Senator Harrell. I know you touched on this in your earlier testimony. You serve on the Ethics Committee, and you saw the change in SB 202 from an original 2-page bill to a 98-page bill that was passed by the House, then by the Senate. Can you describe, just shed a little bit more light on how bipartisan or collaborative the process was in the Georgia State House, or how it wasn't?
There was not an ounce of bipartisanship. And there wasn't back when we had the voting machine legislation either. Amendments were brought forward. They were immediately opposed. 0 amendments were accepted. So I've never seen anything like it, really. It's extremely disappointing.
Thank you. And, because I care so much, for those who may not be aware, prior to joining the Senate, I served as California Secretary of State. I served as the Chief Elections Officer for the state with the largest population, the most diverse population. I'm proud that there we built the most inclusive democracy, maintaining the security, integrity of our elections, but making it easier for eligible voters to register, to stay registered, and to be able to cast their ballot. And so I've tried to figure out where our Republican colleagues are going with this or what they're thinking. And I've heard in event after event, in committee after committee, their mantra. They'll start a lot of their presentations and discussions and debates with a simple line that they're just trying to make it easier to vote and harder to cheat. Have you heard that?
Mhm.
Now, the phrase clearly made its way here to Georgia too.
Mhm.
So I just want to highlight that we all got the second part down right, the harder to cheat. Because study after study, investigation after investigation, commission after commission, all shows the same thing, as Senator Merkley said. Voter fraud in America is exceedingly, exceedingly rare. Election official after election official has stood up for the integrity of the process, including the Georgia Republican Secretary of State,
Mhm.
saying publicly there's zero evidence of any widespread or systematic voter fraud, even standing up to pressure from the former president of the United States. Yet we see Republicans forcing through bills, as I mentioned, state house after state house, including SB 202 here in Georgia. So it makes us wonder, what is their true motive? But they've forgotten the first part of their equation, the easier to vote. And let me not reference the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Let me insert into the conversation here today the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, which was adopted on a bipartisan basis. Oh, how times have changed. But let me read Section 2 of the National Voter Registration Act, and I'll be brief here. In the findings, the Congress finds that the right of citizens of the United States to vote is a fundamental right. And it goes on to say it is the duty of the federal, state, and local governments to promote the exercise of that right. Pretty clear to me. So should we not be better focused if we have the election security piece down, putting more energy and effort onto what it is that truly makes it easier for eligible people to vote, and focus on the issues of long lines, focus on the issues of unfair provisional ballot policies, focus on maybe making it so that more people can vote by mail without needing an excuse, without having to be of a certain age, all these things. So again, and maybe with Senator Harrell, then we'll go to Ms. Butler and Mr. Segarra, one or two examples of SB 202 as, are we making it easier to vote, or were we violating the National Voter Registration Act and not facilitating people's participation in our democracy? Senator.
Yes, I wanted to actually correct myself. When I said 0% bipartisan support, I'd like to change that to 2%. Because I remember that there were two Democratic bills, small Democratic bills that were included in Senate Bill 202. One was to allow absentee ballots to be scanned prior to Election Day in order to speed up the counting. This was something that was done during emergency rule that they codified. The second was a colleague of mine had a bill that required signage to be put up, 4x4 signs at precinct places that had closed or were changed. And that bill was included in Senate Bill 202. So since I am testifying under oath, I wanted to clarify that I wanted to
Very
up
good.
the 0% to 2% participation.
Excellent. Anyone else want to add anything? Okay.
You said what would make that it would make it easy to vote? Well, I think the
Or harder. I'm just trying to vet
well,
out
one of the hard things, of course, is out of the provisional ballot process. Out of precinct voting would make it more difficult for people to exercise their right to vote as opposed to what is required under HAVA to allow them to do that. So to me, that is a provision that needs to be corrected to allow people to vote provisionally.
Mr.
I
Scar?
think we have seen examples of the bad. I think one example of the good is expand the voting window for the early voting to 3 weeks. I think it's very important that people have more time to exercise that constitutional right.
Thank you. I'll just end with a quick note because I know I'm way over my time, but this before 5 versus after 5, on the one hand, some people can say that's completely arbitrary. I don't think so. I've seen elections not just as an elections official, not just as a candidate, not just as a voter, as an organizer. Hey, working folks, there's a surge when you get out for work to go vote on election day. So those who are impacted before and after, it is not proportional. Thank
A
you.
lot of our first responders wouldn't be able to actually exercise their right to vote.
Right. Very good.
I actually filed a bill that would allow people to vote in any precinct. We do that during early voting already. You can go
Yeah.
anywhere in the county and cast your vote.
In the county, you're talking about in the county.
In the county, in the
Right.
county, you can vote anywhere in the county during early voting. We have the technology now to do that. The old precinct idea of voting at your polling place was before we had that technology. So I actually filed a bill that would allow you to vote in any precinct within your county on election day.
I'd be happy to answer any questions for any of your colleagues if they're wondering, because Colorado has that, what they call vote centers. California does. Arizona, Nevada during the early voting period. So
You
you're
see why
moving
we're
the right
so
direction.
lucky to have Senator Padilla on this committee.
Yes.
Not only does he know his stuff, but he takes the red eye to get here. Next up, we've got Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for bringing the committee to the great state of Georgia. Thank you to our panel for your testimony today. I want to note that it's just 3 days since we marked the first anniversary of the passing of Congressman John Lewis, a man who had his skull fractured marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. His self-sacrifice and the sacrifice of hundreds of others that day, paving the way for passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And as you all know well, Congressman Lewis was proud of the progress that our country has made, but he also urged vigilance, because the right to vote can never be taken for granted, and that vigilance is seriously needed today, as Georgia's state legislature has passed restrictions on ballot access, surgically targeting Black voters in the state of Georgia, restricting access to early voting and runoff elections, restricting access to absentee ballots, making it a crime punishable by up to 2 years in prison for a nonpartisan Good Samaritan volunteer to hand a bottle of water to a voter unjustly forced to wait 5 hours to vote. And these restrictions are not meant to solve any real problem observed in the administration of Georgia elections. The only real problem for Georgia's GOP is that they lost. But don't take it from Democrats, don't take it from me, take it from them. Take it from our Republican Lieutenant Governor, Jeff Duncan. Take it from our Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. Take it from the Chief Operations Officer at the Secretary of State's office, Gabriel Sterling, who all avowed repeatedly that there was no evidence of widespread fraud, that it was a secure election conducted successfully. SB 202 passed in this state is a gross and transparent abuse of power, partisan legislation intended to make it harder for some voters to vote to protect Republican power in this state. And we, as the United States Congress, under Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, have the full authority to establish minimum standards for ballot access across this country, to protect the right to vote, and to prevent state legislatures from abusing their legislative power for partisan ends. And I want to ask you, Ms. Butler, to shed some light on the intent of this law, which, as I mentioned, restricts early voting in runoff elections, restricts access to vote by mail. What were the demographics of voters, Ms. Butler, in the 2020 election who made heaviest use of early voting and voting by mail?
Well, early voting in Georgia is very popular. Over 60% of people exercise that method of voting. And certainly it was people of color, African Americans, Asian, Latino, that really used that method to vote because of the pandemic. Beforehand, most of the time we would vote in person, early voting. But this time we used absentee voting, we used early voting. We used both of those tools to really exercise our right to vote. So it most impact will be for people of color, those language assisted, those people in the fields that are working who don't speak English fluently. That will be most impacted by a lot of SB 202 in terms of what IDs I'm going to produce, how many times I produce them, that kind of thing. So it is really aimed and targeted. If you look at all of the polling changes that happen within the state, those are targeted to people of color.
And is it reasonable, Ms. Butler, to presume that these restrictions on access to voting by mail will drive more people to need to vote in person?
Of course it will. I mean, if you can't exercise the absentee ballot process because you don't have the IDs, and by the Secretary of State's own words, there are approximately 3% of the 7 million registered voters who didn't use an ID during that process. Well, that's approximately 200,000 people that can change any outcome of the election. But most of those people are people of color who don't have access to the ID that is required. So yes, it will force them to stand in line. And of course, where all of the polling locations are that have long lines have been documented to be in places where people of color exercise their right to vote. So it would most definitely impact them, whether it would be in Randolph County, in rural Georgia, whether it would be in Gwinnett County, where there is the most diverse population in Georgia. So it will definitely force people to be in long lines to be able to exercise their right to vote. And all of the confusion around the rules is definitely something that will be a problem. To get an ID, driver services are not located in every county. So certain counties would have to drive to other counties. They only have it on certain days. They only have it on certain hours. So everything will make it difficult for people to be able to exercise their right as an absentee ballot and force them to stand in long lines that we saw in the general election, as well as some of the runoff locations where people had to stand for 7, 8, 9 hours to exercise their right to vote.
So, Ms. Butler, just to get it very clearly for the record again, we're restricting access via this partisan legislation in Georgia passed by the Republican state legislature to voting by mail, driving more people to need to vote in person, while at the same time restricting access to early voting in runoff elections, driving up the time folks will have to wait. By the way, as I mentioned to you once, Ms. Butler, my wife and I had to wait 4.5 hours to vote in the primary last year. We voted at a majority Black precinct. We had to wait 4.5 hours to cast our ballots. I was on the ballot. That line was wrapped around the location for hours and hours and hours. And again, for the record, Ms. Butler, which voters, and this has been documented extensively, are typically made to wait much, much longer to vote in our state?
The people that wait the longest in this state are people of color, Black, Latino, Asian American, and other people of color.
Ms. Butler, is it correct that SB 202 allows partisan appointees at the state election board
It
to
does.
replace, reconstitute, and take over county election boards?
It does. And that is the most egregious part of SB 202. Because as you know, those local boards control the implementation of the process from registration to the counting of the ballots to the certification of the election. So where the polling locations are going to be, who's going to be working those polling locations. I can determine whether I'm going to have the hours of early voting from 9 to 5 or 7 to 7. But it is arbitrary. It gives a lot of leeway. But again, if I don't like the outcome of a type of election, then with the reconstitution of the boards, they can take over and put in place a person that really has no knowledge of the process and can just implement what they want to have.
So
available.
partisan appointees can now take over local election boards. And isn't it the case, Ms. Butler, that our own Republican Secretary of State in this most recent election was threatened with political and personal reprisal and potential criminal prosecution by the sitting president of the United States if he didn't, quote, find the votes, end quote, to overturn the will of the people in Georgia?
That's correct.
Thank you to our witnesses. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I think we have a little time for maybe 3-4 minutes of questions. I'll let Senator Merkley start, but I first want to put on for each member, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record 3 letters that urge Congress to pass the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, mentioned by you, Ms. Butler, thank you, to protect the freedom to vote. One submitted by the Southern Poverty Law Center Action Fund, which highlights the challenges many Southern voters face in accessing the ballot box and the need for federal legislation to prevent this. Another submitted by the League of Women Voters of